And where do you see it on the traditional grammar approach from the point of view, or I guess if you're using comprehensible input, you totally believe in that idea. But do you think traditional grammar instruction has a role in it or nothing at all? Or do you think it can be helpful? Do you think it cannot? What's your take on that?
Yeah.
Tough one.
Yeah, this is very, I sort of have immediately 5 different answers to this because it's quite complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay, so to make it very easy at the start, I don't think that if you're only studying grammar and you're memorizing these grammar rules, that you will acquire the language from that. I mean, yeah, that's basically what the research says about it as well, right? You sort of need language input for that. So if you're sort of only focusing on that and trying to memorize all these rules, I don't think you will get very far, at least in my experience. However, I mean, if you combine that, because I have students that say, no, I don't want that. I don't want grammar. That's why I came to you. And I say, fine, we don't need it. We can learn the language without it. Absolutely. Let's do it. But then I have other students as well who are like, oh, I'm actually quite interested in it and I actually really enjoy it. And then I say, okay, let's do it. Let's do my method plus the grammar bit because you enjoy it, because that's another big thing about it, right? Because we need to do stuff that we enjoy. Whatever the thing is we do with the language, we need to enjoy it for motivation purposes and all of that. So yeah, so obviously my students are still my students, so that means it's fine if they want to learn grammar, and we sometimes go through some stuff as well, but because they're still my students, I'm like, well, you also need to do this. You also, this is the stuff you need to listen to, or this is the book you need to read, or whatever. So I think a combination of both works fine, because it obviously doesn't. I mean, if you're still doing the input thing, and if you like the grammar, it doesn't hurt doing that, right? I just wouldn't prioritize it, I think. Yeah. And then the other part of your question, if it's sort of, if it can help at all, acquiring the language, I think so. What I find myself doing sometimes when someone's coming to me and they're really sort of starting from zero, and so we're doing this method straight from the start. I'm giving them stuff to listen to. I say, go familiarize yourself with these new weird sounds. And but so they're doing all of that work at home, all the input, they're listening to stuff, they're reading stuff and all of that. But then sometimes in the lesson, when they're really starting from zero, then we might, just say, okay, by the way, we've got 3 articles. We've got der, die, das in German, for example. And then I just, if you just look, I mean, I don't ever say to them, you need to go home and study this and memorize this now. But if we just sort of look at it and just sort of, make a bit of sense of it, then I just sometimes find that it might speed up the whole process, because it's just sort of a little bit of support underneath with all of that listening you're doing. And, so at the beginning, when I'm really starting from zero, I sometimes go through a bit of grammar, because it might just, speed it up a little bit, because you might be able to make sense of what you're hearing sooner rather than later. But yeah, I mean, as I said, if someone comes to me and they're like, nope, don't like grammar, I'm like, okay. So
yeah, I think we all agree on the fact that with grammar alone, you're not going to be able to learn a language. Like, it's not going to happen.
Right.
With grammar, I mean, like traditional grammar instruction. However, and I talked about this with Ina in the previous episode, I'm totally against it. I'll tell you why. Because I totally understand what you're saying, but I think to me, that's just us adults trying to consciously control the process. Like back to your example, you were talking about people starting from scratch, and I don't know, the articles in German that you talked about. The thing is, we adults, we want to consciously control the process. So we want to know when to use that's the, the problem is they're just two different processes, like the subconscious acquisition of the language and the conscious memorization or conscious studying or learning of the language. They're just two different processes. So what I mean is the fact that you know when, like consciously know when to use a specific article doesn't mean that you're going to be able to produce it the right way when speaking.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to believe, and there's no research on this, it's just my personal feeling, okay? I'm actually starting to think that conscious grammar instruction actually gets in the way. This is my just a feeling, okay? Everybody, just no research, just a feeling. Because when you're learning a language through comprehensible input alone, like quote unquote, that's everything you have to rely on, right? So when you're actually going to try to speak in, the only thing that you have within you is that subconscious acquisition. So you got, if you're in a point in which you can actually communicate, you're going to respond, you're going to use words that come out of you like naturally without you even thinking about them, right? However, if you've been consciously learning grammar, as Stephen Krashen puts it, there's like sort of a monitor that gets in the way, that whenever you're going to say something, there's that grammar instruction getting in the way and stopping you from speaking because you're, wait a second. I was going to say that, but the rule says it shouldn't be that way, right? So then you sort of stop to think about it, and then it actually gets in the way, and your speaking is less fluent. And that's why when people are speaking in a foreign language, you've probably noticed that a lot of people have like a broken speech with a lot of pauses, like you know what I mean, right? And that's because they're trying to consciously access that knowledge from conscious grammar instruction, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the thing is, in a real life, real-time conversation, you just don't have the time to do that. You might have the time if you're writing an article, because you do have the time to think about what you want to say and to recall those specific sentences or structures or articles or whatever they are, right?
Yeah.
But in real time, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But that's my point with it.
Yeah. No, I agree in that point, definitely. Yeah, that's I think when you take it a bit too far. Yeah, so when you're really there trying to have a conversation and you're thinking about all these rules, and it just it doesn't really work well. So yeah, I think for me then, as a teacher who then does use grammar, it's about finding sort of the right balance. So I actually, you reminded me now, I find myself saying a lot to them something like, oh, but don't worry, you don't have to memorize this, you don't look at it at home, it was just now to sort of just see it. And just visualize it, but not like but I think most of the time we it's sort of nice that they've looked at it once, but then after that if I've done my job well, then they're not thinking about the rules when we're done, then sort of start talking and all of that. And I think it's hard to find sort of that sweet spot, that balance, right, between okay, how much do I look at it and how much you know, it's difficult to not start overthinking it, I think, once you've actually looked at it. So yeah, sometimes it might even be easier to just completely disregard it so that you don't ever have that in your head, right? So yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
that's the danger of it, like I said,
Yeah,
because like as a student, you don't even realize it, but if you start trying to consciously learn grammar, you're learning to pay attention to form as opposed to meaning, which is the most important thing. So even if you don't want to, like, your brain is learning to pay attention to specific structures, to verb tenses, to articles, and so on, as opposed to meaning, which is the most important thing, and the way you're going to learn the language, right? But the good news is, just as kids do, like I talked about it within as well. Like I'm not with that. I'm not saying that grammar is not important. All I'm saying is we don't need to consciously study, because we actually acquire it through comprehensible input. And let me give you a couple of examples that I always use, like one with Spanish, one with English. The first one with English is to show that consciously knowing the rules doesn't mean you're going to be able to produce them the right way. And like a quick little example with English is, from a conscious standpoint, the rule of adding an S to the third person singular is as straightforward as it gets, right? Like I want, you want, he wants, she wants. But like, from consciously speaking, that's like super simple, right? Like all the conjugations are the same, but just an S at the end of the third person. And yet, you've probably noticed it when foreigners are speaking English, even people who can actually communicate in the language, they still say he want sometimes when they speak, because again, when you're speaking, you just don't have the time to think about what you want to say. It's not how the process works, right? They're just two different processes. So all that to give you an example of a super simple rule from the conscious standpoint, and everyone understands, right? And yet there are people still not using it the right way when speaking, because it's just two different processes, right? And then the second example with Spanish, now that you're learning Spanish, you might understand. There's a word that every single Spanish-speaking kid uses at the beginning, which is, I mean, the word for broken, yeah, which is, the correct word is roto, okay? But it's an irregular conjugation. This is about all the grammar I'm going to talk about in my project. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's a lot for you. I was just thinking that.
Yeah, just to give you an example. So roto means broken, but it's irregular, but that's the correct conjugation, right? So every single Spanish-speaking kid says rompido at the beginning, which is incorrect, but it would be the regular conjugation. And what that tells us is that kids from comprehensible input and other examples, like from beber, bebido, from comer, comido, etc., the language mechanism in their brains develops the language rule without having to consciously study it, right? So their mechanism thinks, okay, romper, rompido, right? So it's like the language mechanism understands or creates the rule itself without needing to consciously study it, right?
Yeah.
That's why they all say rompido, right? And then again, when what they need in order to get it right is to hear the right word in context many times. You know, if their parents use roto in context many times, eventually they're going to be able to say the right word, right? And I'm sure you can think of many examples like that with German, of course, but with any language.